A boy's body lay in the dirt, riddled with lead. 3 men tied to trees never walked away. A family home burned to the ground. Its survivors left bruised and broken. This was the most infamous revenge feud in American history, and it all started with a stolen pig. In 1878, Randolph McCoy of Kentucky accused Floyd Hatfield of stealing one of his hogs. In the Appalachian Mountains, a pig meant food, money, and survival. The case went to trial, judged by a jury of 6 Hatfields and 6 McCoys. The deciding vote? A McCoy who sided with the Hatfields, later rumored to have been bribed. The decision deepened the rivalry between the two families and set off a chain of violent events. The first of all was Sam McCoy, found lifeless under mysterious circumstances. Then in 1882 came a day of reckoning, when 3 McCoy brothers, furious over some argument, attacked Ellison Hatfield, wounding and firing at him multiple times. Before he even took his last breath, word reached the Hatfields. His family retaliated immediately. They captured the McCoy brothers, tying them to trees and eliminating all 3 in a hail of gunfire. In 1888, the McCoys swore vengeance. But in 1883, the Hatfields took the war to their doorstep. A gang of heavily equipped men, led by Devil Anse Hatfield himself, surrounded the McCoy cabin in the middle of the night. They set it on fire and forced the family to flee in the freezing January cold. 2 of Randolph's children were fatally struck. His wife was so badly injured, she never recovered. The turmoil was so extreme that Kentucky and West Virginia nearly went to war. The Supreme Court had to intervene. In the end, at least a dozen people lost their lives, and it all started over a pig. They gave him a lethal dose. They fired upon him. They attacked him, and yet Grigory Rasputin refused to go down. By the time his body was pulled from the icy Neva River, Russia's most infamous mystic had finally met his end. His attackers wanted revenge for the chaos he had brought to the empire. For years, Rasputin had wielded an almost supernatural influence over the Russian royal family. As a self-proclaimed holy man, he convinced Tsarina Alexandra that he alone could heal her son, the heir to the throne. Soon his voice was shaping state affairs, and gossip spread that he was corrupting the empire from within. By 1916, the Russian aristocracy decided he had to go. A group of conspirators, led by Prince Felix Yusupov, lured Rasputin to a private gathering at the prince's palace. They poured him a drink with a toxic substance, enough to take down several men. But Rasputin kept drinking, completely unaffected. Panicked, they shot him in the chest. He collapsed. They left the room thinking it was over, until suddenly he lurched back to life, clawing his way toward them. In terror, they fired at him again. And again, still he kept on coming. Desperate, they attacked him, restrained him, and threw him into the freezing Neva River. Days later, when his body was found, his arms were positioned as if they had been trying to escape. The attackers had succeeded, but the revenge came too late. Rasputin's end couldn't stop what was coming. Just months later, the Russian Revolution erupted, bringing down the very empire his enemies had tried to protect. Vlad the Impaler's revenge was the stuff of nightmares. As a foreign army marched into Wallachia, they expected an easy victory. What they found instead was a field of fallen soldiers, thousands of bodies skewered on towering wooden stakes. The stench of decay filled the air, and the sight was so horrifying that the invading soldiers turned and fled. See, in 1462, the mighty Ottoman Empire sent an army of over 90,000 men to crush Wallachia, a small but fiercely independent kingdom. And it was one man that stood in their way, Vlad III Dracula, better known as Vlad the Impaler. He had once been a prisoner of the Ottomans, forced to live under their rule as a child. He never forgot, and he never forgave. When Sultan Mehmed II sent envoys demanding Wallachia's surrender, Vlad captured the Ottoman diplomats and had them impaled alive, their bodies left as a warning. Then he launched a merciless guerrilla campaign and ambushed Ottoman forces in the middle of the night, setting villages on fire and contaminating water wells. But his most infamous act of revenge was still to come. As the Ottoman army advanced toward the capital, Vlad prepared his masterpiece of terror. In the heart of Wallachia, outside the city of Targoviste, the invading soldiers came upon the Forest of the Impaled, an endless sea of 20,000 decomposing bodies, each mounted on a wooden stake. Some were still alive. The horror was so overwhelming that the Sultan himself turned back. The Ottomans retreated, unwilling to face a man whose ruthlessness knew no limits. The Romans thought they had won. The Romans had taken Britain, crushed its tribes, and ruled with an iron fist. But when they brutally punished a queen and dishonored her daughters, they unleashed a reckoning of revenge. Boudica, the warrior queen of Iceni, had once been an ally of Rome. When her husband, King Prasutagus, passed away, he left his kingdom to his daughters, trusting the Romans to honor the agreement. Instead, they seized his lands, plundered his wealth, and publicly shamed his family. Boudica herself was severely punished, and her daughters suffered even worse. Rome thought she would submit. Instead, she raised an army. With tens of thousands of warriors from her tribe and others who had suffered under Roman rule, Boudica stormed the city of Camulodunum, modern-day Colchester, which was a Roman settlement. The attack was swift and unstoppable. Buildings burned, Roman soldiers and civilians were eliminated, and anyone who sought shelter in the temple of Claudius was trapped inside and left to perish as flames consumed the city. The governor of Britain, Suetonius Paulinus, rushed to stop her, but Boudica was already on the march. Next, she turned to Londinium, modern London. The Romans abandoned it, leaving behind thousands of civilians, none of whom were spared. The city was leveled, its people wiped out. The same fate befell Verulamium, modern-day St. Albans. Boudica's forces left nothing but scorched ruins and fallen Roman soldiers in their wake. By the time her vengeance was complete, an estimated 70,000 to 80,000 Romans and their allies were lost. Rome finally rallied, and in a decisive battle, Boudica's forces, which outnumbered the Romans but were less organized, were defeated. Refusing capture, she is said to have taken her own life. Prince Igor of Kyiv had been taken out by the Drevlians. They were a neighboring tribe that had once paid him tribute. When he demanded more, they refused, captured him, bent down 2 trees, tied his legs to them, and let go, tearing him limb from limb. Then, as if that wasn't enough, they sent word to his wife, Princess Olga of Kyiv, with an insult. They wanted her to marry their prince, taking Igor's place. Olga sent back a message. She agreed to the proposal on one condition. The Drevlians had to send their most distinguished men to escort her. When the envoys arrived in Kyiv, she welcomed them warmly, then had them thrown into a pit and buried alive. Next, she sent another message. She asked the Drevlians to send even more noblemen, claiming she needed to hear the proposal in person. Eager for an alliance, they complied. This time she invited them to bathe before their meeting. As they stepped into the bathhouse, the doors slammed shut, and her men set it on fire, sealing their fate in flames. Still not satisfied, Olga traveled to the Drevlian capital and pretended to accept their offer. She announced a great funeral feast in honor of her late husband. The Drevlians celebrated, drinking deep into the night. Then her soldiers fell upon them, eliminating them in vast numbers. But her vengeance didn't end there. The survivors retreated into their fortress thinking they were safe. Olga waited. Then she made her final move. She sent them a seemingly merciful offer. If they surrendered, she would spare them. As a token of peace, she asked for only 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows from each household. Desperate, they agreed. But when night fell, Olga's soldiers tied burning cloth to the birds and released them. The birds flew back to their nests inside the fortress. In minutes, the city was engulfed in flames. The people who fled were cut down. The rest perished in the fire. Pierre Picaud was the real-life inspiration for the famous novel The Count of Monte Cristo. But before that, he was a simple French shoemaker with a bright future. He was engaged to a wealthy woman, happy and content. That was until 3 so-called friends decided they couldn't stand his success. They accused him of being a British spy, and with no trial or chance to prove his innocence, Pierre was thrown into prison. For 7 years, he wasted away inside the Fenestral fortress. But prison didn't break him, it made him patient. While locked away, he befriended a dying priest who told him of a hidden treasure buried in Milan. When Pierre was finally released, he went searching for it, and when he found it, he was no longer just a shoemaker and ex-con. He was a man with money, power, and a mission. He changed his name, crafted a new identity, and spent the next 10 years hunting down the men who had betrayed him. One lost everything after Pierre carefully destroyed his business. Another was found lifeless, under unclear circumstances. For the last and worst of them, Pierre made sure his downfall was slow. He secretly gave him toxic substances that drained him and made him sick. Church bells rang out across Palermo, Sicily. Moments later, the streets erupted in chaos. French soldiers were dragged from their homes, attacked in the alleys, and brutally struck down in the squares. Some were butchered in their beds. Others were torn apart by angry mobs. By dawn, thousands had lost their lives. This was the Sicilian Vespers, a violent uprising born from years of oppression, humiliation, and a thirst for revenge. For years, Sicily had suffered under the rule of Charles Anjou, the French king who controlled the island. His soldiers treated the locals like second-class citizens. They were overtaxed, had their land seized, and faced daily oppression. The French soldiers were especially notorious of their treatment of Sicilian women. Then, on that fateful evening on March 30th, everything snapped. As Sicilians gathered for an Easter Monday church service, a French soldier allegedly harassed a Sicilian woman in the crowd. The people had had enough. A mob formed instantly and attacked the soldier, taking his life. His comrades rushed to intervene, but the crowd turned on them too. Knives and swords were drawn, and an uprising was in the making. Word spread like wildfire. Throughout the night, Sicilians stormed the streets, breaking into homes, tracking down French soldiers, and eliminating them on the spot. They even devised a merciless test to find any Frenchmen trying to hide. They forced them to say Sicily e Tria, a phrase in the Sicilian dialect. If the pronunciation was even slightly off, the accused was immediately struck down. By the time the sun came up, over 2,000 French soldiers and officials had fallen. But the revenge didn't stop there. The attacks continued for weeks, with the entire island rising against French rule. Soon the Sicilians invited the King of Aragon to take over, which launched a full-scale war that drove the French from Sicily for good. When Timur the Lame set his sights on Delhi in 1398, he wasn't just looking to conquer. He was out for vengeance. He believed the city's Muslim rulers had betrayed their faith by being too tolerant of Hindus. What followed was one of the most brutal retaliations in history. Timur, also known as Tamerlane, had built an empire through unyielding military campaigns. His armies swept across Asia, leaving cities in ruins and empires shattered. But when he marched into India, he claimed he was there to punish Delhi's ruler, Sultan Nasir-ud-Din Muhammad Shah Tughlaq, for allowing religious diversity in his kingdom. Timur's forces clashed with the Delhi Sultanate outside the city, and the battle was swift. His army, made up of hardened warriors from Central Asia, crushed the opposition. But the real devastation began after the fighting ended. Before entering Delhi, Timur ordered his soldiers to eliminate 100,000 captives, mostly soldiers who had surrendered. He claimed he couldn't spare the men to guard them. Once inside the city, the troops unleashed chaos on an unimaginable scale. Homes were set ablaze, markets were ransacked, and anyone left in the streets was struck down. The devastation continued for days, turning Delhi into a wasteland. To send a message, Timur had thousands of skulls stacked into towering pyramids, a signature move he used in every major conquest. By the time his army moved on, Delhi was left in ruins, its once thriving population decimated. Rome had taken his land. They had humiliated his people, and when they pushed him too far, King Mithridates VI of Pontus answered with one of the most ruthless acts of revenge in history. It became known as the Asiatic Vespers. For years, Mithridates had watched Rome tighten its grip on his kingdom. They imposed heavy taxes, placed puppet rulers in power, and treated the local Greeks and Anatolians like second-class citizens. But in 88 BC, when the Romans stripped him of his lands and forced him into exile, he had enough. Mithridates returned with fire and fury, rallying his people against Roman rule and wanting revenge. He sent out secret orders to cities across Asia Minor, instructing them to rise up at the exact same time. Then, on a single night, it happened. Across the region, Roman citizens, men, women, children, were hunted down and eliminated in large numbers. In Ephesus, Romans were forced out of sanctuaries where they had begged for safety. In Pergamum, Smyrna, and dozens of other cities, entire Roman communities were wiped out. No one was spared. Families were eliminated in their homes. Merchants were struck down in the streets, and those who tried to flee were taken out. By the time the sun rose, an estimated 80,000 Romans and Italians had fallen. But Rome never forgave. This uprising sparked the First Mithridatic War, as furious Roman legions sailed across to crush him. Mithridates fought them off for decades, surviving 3 wars and multiple plots against his life, always one step ahead of his enemies. He even built up an immunity to toxins, fearing he would one day be betrayed. In the end, Rome's revenge came. Mithridates was finally cornered. But before they could capture him, he chose his own fate, choosing to end his own life over the humiliation of falling into Roman hands. Shaka Zulu built an empire with discipline, strategy, and fear. But when his mother, Nandi, passed in 1827, the warrior king turned his grief into something far more dangerous: revenge. Not against a single person, but against his own people. Nandi had been Shaka's greatest protector. As a child, he was cast out by his father and ridiculed for being illegitimate. He never forgot the humiliation, and when he rose to power, he ruled with an iron fist. But nothing shaped his rage more than the loss of his mother. When she passed, Shaka ordered a mourning period unlike anything seen before. No crops could be planted, no milk could be used, one of the main food sources of the Zulu people. Expectant mothers were not allowed to survive, as no child should be born during his time of grief. Thousands were eliminated, some simply because they weren't seen as mourning hard enough. Even the cattle weren't spared. Many were sacrificed so their calves would know the pain of losing a mother. This went on for an entire year. But revenge at this scale was unsustainable. His erratic behavior made his closest allies uneasy. By 1828, his own half-brothers had seen enough. They removed him, ending his rule before his vengeance on society could consume the Zulu kingdom entirely. On Sunday morning in 1478, the people of Florence gathered inside the great cathedral for Mass. Among them were the city's rulers, Lorenzo de' Medici, and his younger brother, Giuliano. But as the prayers were spoken, the attackers moved into place. Then, at the exact moment the priest raised the Eucharist, the attack came. Giuliano was struck 19 times with a sword. Lorenzo barely escaped, wounded but alive. This was the Pazzi Conspiracy, an attempted coup by the powerful Pazzi family and their allies to destroy the Medici rule. But they failed. And what followed was revenge so swift, so unyielding, that it became legend. Lorenzo wasted no time. Within hours, the city was locked down, and Medici loyalists were tracking down conspirators in the streets. The men who had attacked them inside the cathedral were dragged outside and strung up from the Palazzo della Signoria, Florence's town hall. Their bodies were left on display for days as a warning. But Lorenzo wasn't done. Jacopo Pazzi, the head of the family, was captured, severely punished, and hanged from the same government building his ancestors had helped construct. Francesco Pazzi, who had personally attacked Giuliano, was eliminated and left suspending beside him. The Archbishop of Pisa, one of the conspirators, was seized by an angry mob and thrown from a window, suffering fatal injuries on the streets below. Others were subjected to harsh interrogation, banished, or simply disappeared. The purge didn't stop at Florence. Lorenzo used his influence to have the Pazzi name erased. Their properties were confiscated, their family members pursued, and their very existence wiped from official records. For years, Countess Elizabeth Bathory ruled over her lands in Hungary, with absolute power. Nobles feared her, peasants whispered of her cruelty, and young girls who entered her castle were never seen again. But when the tables turned, and vengeance came for her, it was as cold and merciless as she had been. Bathory, one of the most powerful women in Europe, was infamous for her ruthlessness. Hundreds of servants vanished under her rule, with rumors spreading that she severely mistreated them for pleasure. Some claimed she performed dark rituals, believing it would keep her youthful. Whether these stories were exaggerated or not, one thing was certain: too many had disappeared, and her actions had made powerful enemies. In 1610, Hungarian authorities, led by Count Georgi Thurzo, launched an investigation, and they wanted retribution. One winter night, soldiers stormed her castle. What they found inside confirmed the worst of the rumors: evidence of inhumane conditions, stains of past cruelty, and prisoners barely clinging to life. Servants testified against her, recounting horrors that stunned even hardened officials. But Bathory was nobility, too high-ranking for public trial, so they punished her in a far worse way than taking her life. She was imprisoned inside a small chamber within her castle, its windows blocked off, its door left only with a small slot for food. For 4 years, she sat alone in isolation, trapped in the very walls of the castle where she had once reigned. When the guards finally entered in 1614, they found her lifeless. Thank you for watching the video all the way to the end. There's another video here that YouTube thinks you might like, so please check it out, and comment down below on what videos you want to see from this channel in the future. Thanks again. See you next time.